At 9:11 in the morning on October 25, 1944, Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo stood on the bridge of Yamato, the largest warship ever built, and ordered his fleet to turn north. He was 45 miles from Leyte Gulf. He had 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Between him and the Gulf stood a handful of small escort carriers and their screens, ships that had been running from him for the past 2 hours, taking losses, burning. He was winning. 6 minutes after ordering his fleet to consolidate, he ordered a full withdrawal. In the 8 decades since that morning, naval historians, strategists, and veterans of the Pacific War have returned to those 6 minutes again and again, not because the decision was complicated, because it was not. The numbers were clear. The objective was within reach. The opposition was outmatched. And yet, the easy explanation is that Kurita broke under pressure. The harder question, the one that does not resolve cleanly, is what breaking under pressure actually looks like in a man who has lived through 2 days of sustained combat, who has already survived having his flagship sunk beneath him, who has watched the most powerful warship in the Japanese Navy go under, and who is standing on a bridge receiving radio signals that no one is answering. To understand those 6 minutes, you have to understand the 72 hours that produced them. It begins not at the entrance to Leyte Gulf. It begins 3 days earlier in the darkness of the Palawan Passage when the first torpedo hit. The morning of October 23, 1944. Center Force, Japan's most powerful remaining surface fleet, was moving through the Palawan Passage, heading northeast toward the Philippines. Kurita was on the bridge of Otago, his flagship, the ship he had commanded through the campaigns that had brought Japan's navy to this point. At 6:32 in the morning, the first torpedo hit. USS Darter and USS Dace had found Center Force the night before. They had tracked it through the darkness, reported its position, and moved into firing range before dawn. Darter put 4 torpedoes into Otago. The ship was gone in less than 30 minutes. Kurita went into the water. Not metaphorically, not in the way that commanders lose ships from a distance and absorb the news from a chart room. He was in the sea. His flagship was sinking around him and he was swimming. He was pulled from the water and transferred to Yamato. In the same engagement, USS Dace sank the heavy cruiser Maya. Darter put 2 torpedoes into Takao, leaving her too damaged to continue, forcing her to turn back toward Brunei. 3 heavy cruisers gone or crippled before Center Force had fired a single shot in the operation it had been assembled to fight. There is no record of what Kurita said or felt in those hours. The historical record preserves his orders, his signals, his reported positions. It does not preserve what it was like to begin the largest naval operation in history by swimming away from your sinking flagship. What the record does preserve is what came next. October 24th, the Sibuyan Sea. Center Force entered the confined waters between the Philippine Islands, moving northeast, still on course for San Bernardino Strait. American carrier aircraft found them before noon. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a sustained aerial assault, multiple attack waves over the course of 8 hours, against a fleet that had no air cover. Japan's carriers were far to the north, part of a separate operation. Kurita had no fighter protection. He had anti-aircraft guns and the ability to maneuver, and nothing else. The aircraft kept coming. Yamato was hit twice by bombs. Nagato was hit. Haruna was hit. And then there was Musashi. Yamato and Musashi had been built to be the final argument, the ships so large, so heavily armored, so thoroughly engineered that no combination of conventional weapons should have been able to sink them. Japanese sailors called them hotels, not because of any particular comfort, but because they were so large, so well provisioned, and so rarely committed to actual combat that they seemed more like installations than warships. On October 24th, that changed. Musashi absorbed more than a dozen torpedo hits and at least 17 bomb strikes over the course of the afternoon. She was a ship of more than 65,000 tons. She went under at 7:36 in the evening. Kurita watched this from Yamato's bridge. He had already lost his flagship that morning. He had spent hours on a ship being attacked by waves of aircraft he could not fight back against effectively. And now, the ship that was supposed to be unsinkable, the ship that represented the outer limit of what Japanese naval engineering could produce, was gone. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, Kurita turned center force around. He had been ordered to proceed to San Bernardino Strait. He reversed course anyway. His reasoning, as recorded in subsequent communications, was the sustained air attack and the losses his force had taken. Tokyo ordered him to turn back. At approximately 5:15 in the afternoon, he reversed course again, back toward San Bernardino Strait, back toward the original mission. This reversal, this moment of turning back and then turning back again, is rarely examined in the accounts of Leyte Gulf that focus on the larger battle. It should be. It is the first visible indication that Kurita's decision-making that day was not operating in a straight line. A commander who turns back and then unturns back within 2 hours is a commander receiving conflicting pressures from above, from the situation, from whatever was happening inside his own assessment of what was possible and what was not. He continued northeast through the night. San Bernardino Strait. The narrow passage between Luzon and Samar that center force needed to transit to reach Leyte Gulf. American naval doctrine, and common sense, suggested it would be defended. It was not. Admiral Halsey had taken his carrier fleet north, drawn by the decoy operation Ozawa was running with Japan's remaining carriers. The strait was open. Kurita did not know this. He transited in darkness, expecting contact, expecting resistance, finding neither. What he found instead was open water, and the coast of Samar ahead of him as the sky began to lighten on the morning of October 25th. Consider what Kurita carried with him into that dawn. His flagship had been sunk beneath him less than 48 hours earlier. He had spent 8 hours under sustained air attack with no ability to strike back. He had watched Musashi, the most powerful ship in the Japanese Navy, go under. He had reversed course under pressure, and then reversed again, under different pressure. He had transited a strait he expected to be defended in darkness, not knowing whether the ships waiting at the other end were destroyers or an entire carrier task force. He had sent radio signals through the night. No one had answered. Whether Kurita slept in those hours is not recorded. What is recorded is the sequence of events he had lived through, and the man that sequence had produced by the time the sun came up over Samar. That man was about to make the most consequential decision of his life. He had approximately 3 hours before he would have to make it. At 6:45 in the morning on October 25th, a lookout on Yamato reported masts on the horizon, then flight decks, then the unmistakable silhouette of aircraft carriers. Kurita had not expected this. The plan had assumed he would transit San Bernardino Strait undetected and arrive off Leyte Gulf before significant American naval forces could respond. What he was looking at, or what he believed he was looking at, suggested the Americans had known he was coming. He was looking at Taffy 3, a task unit whose primary purpose was providing air support for the Leyte landing operation, not fighting surface engagements against battleships. Kurita did not know that. What he saw through his binoculars in the early morning light, with smoke beginning to rise and the small ships accelerating away at their maximum speed, did not look like escort carriers and destroyer escorts. The flight decks were real. The wakes of the fleeing ships were long and fast. Aircraft were launching from the carriers in the confusion of the moment, climbing away at steep angles. His pilots had reported fleet carriers in the area. His charts showed this was a reasonable place for them to be. The ships ahead of him were running hard. Escort ships running at full speed through heavy seas, laying smoke. They do not look like small ships. They look like what they are doing, which is fleeing at full speed, and full speed in bad conditions looks, at distance, through binoculars, in the early morning light, like something considerably larger and more dangerous than what they actually were. He ordered general attack, not a coordinated assault with designated targets and sequenced firing lines. General attack. The order that releases each ship to engage the nearest enemy independently, without waiting for a unified battle plan. It was the order of a commander who did not have time or did not have enough information to issue something more specific. Each of his ships went after whatever it could see. What followed was 90 minutes of combat that looked, from the Japanese side, like a victory in progress. Yamato's guns were firing at carriers. The carriers were taking damage. The smaller American ships, the destroyers and destroyer escorts, were doing something that no tactical manual adequately prepared anyone to expect. They were attacking Johnston, Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, 3 small ships that had no business charging a force of battleships and heavy cruisers. They charged anyway. They fired their guns. They launched their torpedoes. They drove directly at ships 10 times their size and forced those ships to maneuver, to break formation, to change course, to respond to a threat that should not have been threatening. Kurita's carefully assembled force was spending its time maneuvering against destroyer escorts instead of closing on the carriers. Yamato herself was forced to turn away from a torpedo spread, the largest warship in the world, spending critical minutes running from a ship a fraction of her size. He had ordered general attack, which meant he had lost centralized control of his force. His ships were scattered across miles of ocean, each pursuing its own targets, each generating its own smoke and wakes and radio traffic. He was receiving fragments. Pilots reported hits on fleet carriers. Ship commanders reported engaging cruisers. The radio traffic was heavy, confused, and contradictory, and through all of it American aircraft were attacking, from the carriers, from other nearby units, climbing through the smoke and coming back around. Chokai was hit and left dead in the water. Chikuma was hit and left dead in the water. Suzuya was damaged and falling behind. 3 heavy cruisers, gone or effectively gone, in the same engagement where he believed he was sinking fleet carriers. By 9 in the morning, the tactical picture had simplified in one respect. Taffy 3 was still running, still taking damage. One of the carriers was visibly dying. The destroyers that had attacked him so aggressively were now themselves damaged or sinking. He was winning. The Gulf was 45 miles to the south, and then the picture complicated in every other respect simultaneously. A radio signal, received, not fully confirmed, suggested a substantial American carrier force was operating to the north. The chain of command in Tokyo had not answered his signals. His force was spread across miles of ocean with no coherent formation. He did not know how many aircraft the Americans had left. He did not know what was waiting in Leyte Gulf. He did not know where Halsey was. He did not know that the answers to most of those questions, had he known them, would have told him to continue south. At 9:11 in the morning, he ordered his fleet to consolidate, to gather, to stop the scattered pursuit and come back together into something that resembled a coherent force. It was a reasonable order. It was also the moment when continuing south became, for the first time, something other than automatic, because consolidating Pausing meant making a decision. And the decision, when Kurita finally made it 6 minutes later, was not the one the map suggested. In the minutes after that order, the situation on Yamato's bridge was this. The firing had not stopped. American aircraft were still coming in. The radio was producing a steady stream of reports from ships scattered across miles of ocean. Damage assessments, position updates, requests for instruction that Kurita could not yet answer because he did not yet know what to instruct. He was trying to see the whole picture. The problem was that the picture had too many pieces, and some of them were wrong. Start with what he knew. He knew Taffy 3 was hurt. One of the carriers was burning and slowing. The destroyers that had attacked so aggressively were themselves damaged or gone. The carriers were still running south, but they were taking hits. He knew he had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya, gone or effectively gone. That was a cost he had not anticipated paying against what he had believed were fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. Against escort carriers and destroyer escorts, it was a cost that did not make sense. He knew the Gulf was within reach. Those were the things he knew. Now consider what he did not know. The picture he was working from was wrong in almost every important respect. Halsey was not closing from behind. He was hundreds of miles to the north, chasing Ozawa's decoys. The strait behind him remained open and undefended. The landing force he had been sent to destroy had largely dispersed, the transports unloaded, the major vessels gone, and the carrier force, the radio signal warned him about to the north, did not exist in the form the signal implied. Each of those facts, had he known them, pointed in the same direction. Together they would have told him, the way is open, the objective is within reach. Continue south. He knew none of them. The chain of command that had sent him here had gone silent. He was making a decision about a battlefield he could not see, using information that was hours old, with no guidance from above. The first pressure pulling at his decision was the accumulated weight of everything that had come before. Not panic, not a dramatic collapse. Something quieter and more insidious, the way that prolonged stress narrows a mind's capacity until the full range of options is no longer available to it. A commander who has absorbed the loss of his flagship, who has spent 8 hours under air attack with no ability to strike back, who has watched Musashi go under, that commander does not process new information the way a rested commander does. He processes it faster and less completely. He reaches conclusions sooner with less examination of alternatives. This is not weakness, it is physiology. The second pressure was the signal about the carrier force to the north. He could not confirm it, he could not deny it. What he could do was calculate what it meant if it was true. If there was a substantial American carrier force moving south toward him, if Halsey had not taken the bait, had not gone north, was instead closing from behind, then continuing into Leyte Gulf meant sailing into an enclosed space with an enemy fleet cutting off his exit. The logic of the threat was sound. The threat itself was not real. But Kurita had no way to know that. The third pressure was the question of what, exactly, he would find in Leyte Gulf. He had been sent to destroy the American landing force, the transports, the supply ships, the vessels that had put troops on the beach and could put more. But the landing had happened. The troops were ashore. The transports, if they followed standard practice, had unloaded and moved on. What was left? He had no current intelligence on the contents of Leyte Gulf. The mission that had been the justification for sending center force through everything it had come through was based on a picture of Leyte Gulf that may no longer have been accurate. The fourth pressure was the one he articulated most consistently across every account he gave after the war. He believed he had been fighting fleet carriers. He had been told there were fleet carriers in the area. The ships he had engaged were running, taking damage, launching aircraft from flight decks he could see with his own eyes. If those were fleet carriers, if he had spent 90 minutes engaging fleet carriers and had damaged or sunk several of them, then he had already accomplished something significant. And if that was true, then the calculus of continuing south looked different. Not because Leyte Gulf was not worth reaching, but because the cost of reaching it, against an unknown number of American aircraft with a degraded force, into waters whose contents he could not confirm, while a carrier fleet he could not locate might be closing from the north. That cost looked different against the backdrop of a mission he believed he might have already partially accomplished. These four pressures did not arrive in sequence. They did not present themselves one at a time, clearly labeled, waiting to be evaluated and resolved. They arrived simultaneously, tangled together, each one affecting how the others looked. A man, under less cumulative stress, might have separated them, might have said, "The carrier threat to the north is unconfirmed. Weight it accordingly." Might have said, "Leyte Gulf intelligence is old, but the mission objective does not change because the intelligence is old." Might have said, "The ships I have been engaging are escort carriers, not fleet carriers. I can tell by now, after 90 minutes, from the damage patterns, from the size of the aircraft, from the weight of the defensive fire." A rested man, with a functioning command structure, receiving current intelligence, might have said all of those things. Kurita said none of them. At 9:17 in the morning, he ordered Center Force to withdraw to the north. The order was clean, direct, and final. There was no recorded hesitation in its transmission. Whatever combination of exhaustion and bad information and isolation and miscalculation had produced the decision, it arrived on the radio as a clear command. And Center Force turned. 45 miles to the south, Leyte Gulf waited. What was in it and what was not in it, Kurita would not learn until after the war. The war ended 10 months later. Kurita survived it. And when the American officers of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sat down with him in the autumn of 1945, they asked him the question that everyone who had studied the battle would spend the next 80 years asking. "Why did you turn back?" he answered. He answered in 1945, and he answered again in subsequent interviews over the following decades, and the answers he gave were not the same, not wildly different, not contradictory in ways that suggested deception, but different enough that historians working from his testimony have reached 4 distinct conclusions, each one supportable, none of them complete. The first conclusion is the one that feels most obvious from the outside. Kurita turned back because the previous 72 hours had reduced his capacity to make sound decisions. The evidence for this is not direct. There is no document in which Kurita says he was too exhausted to think clearly because no commander says that about himself. The evidence is circumstantial and cumulative. His decision to reverse course in the Sibuyan Sea, and then reverse again 2 hours later, suggests a command mind under competing pressures it was not resolving cleanly. His order for general attack at the start of the Samar engagement, releasing centralized control at the moment when centralized control was most needed, suggests a commander defaulting to a broad directive when a specific one would have served better. And the decision itself, turning away from an objective that was within reach, with opposition that was running from him, is the kind of decision that is very difficult to explain through any purely rational calculus. The argument against this conclusion is that Kurita continued to function. He issued orders. He managed the withdrawal. He brought most of Center Force back intact. What he may have experienced is something more precise and more difficult to measure, not collapse, but a narrowing, until the full range of options was no longer available to him. The second conclusion rests on what Kurita said most consistently. He believed he was engaging fleet carriers. In his survey interrogation, and in later interviews, he returned to this point repeatedly. The ships he had seen had flight decks. His pilots had reported fleet carriers in the area, the aircraft coming off those decks, the wakes of the ships running from him. It all fit the picture of a fleet carrier engagement. The argument for this conclusion is that the confusion was genuinely possible. Escort carriers are not small ships. In poor visibility at the opening of an engagement with smoke and spray and the chaos of a force that has just gone to general attack, misidentification is not stupidity. It is the normal condition of combat. The argument against it is time. By 9 in the morning, Kurita had been fighting Taffy 3 for more than 90 minutes. 90 minutes is long enough to observe that the aircraft coming off those carriers are not the type carried by fleet carriers. Long enough to observe that the defensive fire from the screening ships, while aggressive, is not what heavy cruisers produce. Long enough to correct the initial misidentification. Whether he did or whether the original impression had fixed itself too firmly to be revised under those conditions, he never said directly. The third conclusion is the one he stated most explicitly, and the one that is hardest to evaluate because it depends on information he did not have. He turned back because he believed a carrier force was approaching from the north. In his telling, this was not a vague anxiety. It was a specific tactical concern that continuing south into Leyte Gulf would expose center force to attack from the rear by a fleet he could not see and could not confirm. The signal that suggested this carrier force was real enough to act on. The problem is that the signal was wrong. Halsey was hundreds of miles away. There was no carrier fleet closing from the north. If Kurita had known that, if anyone had told him that Halsey had taken the bait, that San Bernardino Strait remained unguarded, that the way south was open, the calculus changes entirely. He did not know, and the particular weight of this conclusion is that it represents a rational response to false information, a sound decision made on a foundation that did not exist. The fourth conclusion is the one that is most uncomfortable for those who want the story to be simple. Some historians, working from the operational record rather than Kurita's testimony, have argued that he made a deliberate and defensible strategic choice. The landing at Leyte had already succeeded. The troops were ashore. The transports had unloaded. Destroying what remained in the Gulf would not reverse what had already happened on the beach. His force had taken significant losses. 3 heavy cruisers gone. Yamato's ammunition was not unlimited. American air power had already demonstrated what it could do to his ships in open water. In this reading, Kurita looked at the cost of continuing and the benefit of continuing and concluded that the benefit did not justify the cost, not because he was broken, not because he was confused, not because he was misled, but because he made a calculation and the calculation came out negative. The argument against this conclusion is his own behavior after the war. A commander who made a clear strategic decision, one he believed was correct, tends to defend it. Kurita did not defend it. He explained it differently in different conversations. He expressed no certainty about it. A man who turned back because he had reasoned his way to a clear conclusion does not spend 30 years giving inconsistent accounts of how he reached it. What the 4 conclusions share, the thread that runs through exhaustion and misidentification and false intelligence and deliberate calculation, is that none of them, alone, is sufficient. The decision was not produced by a single cause. It was produced by a man, a specific man, in a specific condition, holding specific information that was partly wrong, receiving no guidance from above, in command of a fleet that was scattered and damaged and still being attacked from the air. That man made a decision. And the decision cannot be fully separated from everything that had made him that man by 9:17 on that particular morning. Kurita's chief of staff, Koyanagi Tomiji, was present on Yamato's bridge throughout the engagement. After the war, he wrote that the withdrawal could not be reduced to a single explanation, that the reasons were multiple, and that no single one of them was sufficient by itself. Kurita Takeo lived until December 19, 1977, 33 years after Leyte Gulf. He did not write a memoir. He gave interviews when asked, to historians, to journalists, to the occasional naval officer working through what had happened in the Pacific War and why. In those interviews, across 3 decades, he was consistent about the facts, the timeline, the signals, the losses, the order to withdraw. He was not consistent about what those facts meant, or what had produced the decision that sat at the center of all of them. In some accounts, he emphasized the carrier threat from the north. In others, he spoke more about the losses his force had already taken. In at least one late interview, he suggested that the landing had already succeeded and that there was nothing in Leyte Gulf worth the cost of reaching it. He never settled on one explanation. He answered the question every time it was asked. He never answered it the same way twice. What he arrived at in those minutes cost Japan the last serious opportunity it had to disrupt the American return to the Philippines. Whether it also saved the lives of the men remaining in center force, whether the American air power that would have met him in Leyte Gulf would have finished what it had started in the Sibuyan Sea, is a question that has no answer, because it is a question about something that did not happen. Leyte Gulf is recorded as the largest naval battle in history. It was decided by many things, by Halsey's decision to follow Ozawa, by the extraordinary actions of the ships of Taffy III, by the logistical achievement of the American landing itself. But at its center, at the hinge point where the battle could have gone differently, is a man on a bridge at 9:17 in the morning, making a decision, alone. Whether it was the right decision is a question Kurita himself refused to answer definitively. He lived 33 years with it. He turned it over in his mind enough times to produce a different account of it each time he was asked. And in the end, in the last interviews, in the final years, he said he did not know. Not as an evasion, not as the false modesty of a man who had made his peace with a difficult choice, but as the honest conclusion of a man who had spent 3 decades examining that decision and had found, at the end of all that examination, that certainty was not available. 45 miles. The distance between Kurita's position at 9/11 on October 25, 1944, and the entrance to Leyte Gulf. 2 hours of sailing, perhaps less. The distance between what happened and what might have happened. It is, in the end, the distance that defines him, not the battles he fought, not the ships he commanded, not the losses he absorbed on the 2 days that preceded that morning. The distance he did not cross. And the question, still open after 80 years, of what was waiting on the other side,